And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by saying that the name proposed, or rather imposed, for today's event intentionally is designed to mislead. If anybody is occupying Ukrainian territory today, then it is the Maidan authorities that are under external management and control. I'm not even going to talk about Crimea today. Crimea is Russia. This matter was closed once and for all by the Crimeans themselves. The Ukrainian authorities and President Poroshenko have already personally, long ago, made the slogan of Russian aggression, annexation and occupation their political credo. They're using this to intimidate the world and in their country incite hatred to Russia and everything Russian, having no disdain for offensive statements made against the Russian leadership and people. This has become, if you will, the signature style of the Ukrainian authorities and President Poroshenko personally. It is a shame that you are not able to listen to this in the original. A great deal is lost in the translation. Demonstrating a style of communication borrowed from the lexicon of the place, the Ukrainian leadership is trying to demonstrate to the entire world their European civilization, which they take such pride in, and how different they are from the uncultured Muscovy. President Poroshenko, elected in 2014, declared himself to be the president of peace, promising to immediately put an end to the conflict in Donbass. But the global community had barely fallen in line behind this announcement when President Poroshenko became the president of war, a war which continues to this day. We are unfortunately forced to say with regret that wherever President Poroshenko goes, we smell gunpowder. The gunpowder of a fratricidal war. I remind you, it wasn't Donbass that marched on Kiev. It was the knights of the Ukrainian forces, as President Poroshenko puts it, that came to Donbass. It was from their weapons that residential parts of Donetsk and other cities were shelled, in which Ukrainian citizens were killed. The slogan of Russian aggression is very convenient to Kiev to justify its actions and at the same time its inaction. But here is the problem. On the 12th of February, we had to ask a direct question to the head of the Special Monitoring Mission of the OSCE in Ukraine, Ambassador Apakan, and he was forced to say that there are no regular Russian forces in Donbass. Clearly, President Poroshenko was not told about the outcomes of the Security Council meeting on the 12th of February devoted to the 4th anniversary of the Minsk agreements. In this context, his words, truly twisted reality, take on a new, opposite sense. Kiev is treating the Russian aggression to something that is far from these events and that has nothing to do with where they came from and the details of this. Understanding everything, but for these cunning Western backers. Today, it's very fashionable to say that it's highly likely that Russia is guilty of anything. No proof is needed for any of this. But now, this idea and this statement is now a further part of President Poroshenko's election campaign, which began long ago here in the walls of the General Assembly. Really, the real barrier on the path to peace in Ukraine is the Kiev's authorities' lies and glaring reluctance to implement the Minsk agreements. And even more specifically, it's Kiev's reluctance to have a dialogue with its own people. But why did this population rise up in the first place? In order to understand that, particularly the large amount of lies and propaganda coming from Kiev and spread around in the West, you need to go back to the beginning and understand where the Ukrainian crisis really began. Allow me to remind you here the sequence of events 5 years ago. In October 2013, President Yanukovych, having analysed the text of the agreement on association between Ukraine and the European Union in detail, asked for additional time so as to once and for all take a decision on how appropriate it was to sign it. Nevertheless, On the 13th of November 2013, the Ukrainian opposition declared mass protest actions if the leadership of the country did not sign the agreement on association with the European Union. On the 21st of November, mass protests began in the center of Kiev. On the 30th of November, clashes with police were involved with fighters from neo-nationalist groups, the Right Sector, an organization which was subsequently prohibited in Russia. On the 1st of December, attacks on peaceful demonstrators began, and the European diplomats, the Vice President of the European Parliament, Jacek Protasevich, the former President of the European Parliament, Jerzy Buzek, the former head of the Polish government and leader of the Law and Justice Party, Jarosław Kaczynski, all joined in with the demonstrators. On the 9th of December in Kiev, the High Commissioner for EU on Foreign Affairs, Catherine Ashton, arrived in Kiev, and also US Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland. In the morning, the following morning, they visited Maidan, where they gave out bread and cakes, and subsequently did not hide that since Ukraine had acquired independence, the US support for the development of democratic institutions, civil society, and state governance, and for other purposes in Ukraine, $5 billion had been spent. On the 25th of January 2014, talks began with President Yanukovych and the opposition. On the 19th and 20th of February in Kiev, large-scale military clashes began. Many people were killed and injured, including at the hands of still unknown snipers. However, even the day before, nationalists had seized arms, caches, and army units. The people who died at the hands of these snipers were called the Heavenly Hundred and became a symbol of the victims of the Yanukovych regime. However, currently, there is enough evidence to say that these people were the victims of the monstrous provocations of the supporters of the Maidan, who needed ritual bloodshed in order to incite national hatred, popular hatred, and attract supporters. On the 21st of February, the agreement on the settlement of the political crisis in Ukraine was concluded, a substantial one, which was signed by Yanukovych and leaders of the opposition in the presence of guarantors, the ministers of foreign affairs of Germany and Poland, and the head of the Continental Europe Directorate of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France. However, the following day, leaders of the radical opposition, including this right sector, refused to acknowledge the agreement and began a new attack on government buildings in violation of paragraph 5 of this document. Having clashed with the threat to his own life, Yanukovych was forced to leave Kiev because the hopes for any guarantees for his personal safety and security were no longer there in these conditions. The outcomes of the Maidan, now known in Ukraine as the Revolution of Dignity, became for ordinary Ukrainians something that was quite unexpected. The people didn't quite realize immediately that before their eyes there had been a genuine coup d'etat that had taken place. Let us recall and look at these events with the eyes of Russian language-speaking people who make up at least 40% of the population of Ukraine. What did they hear trying to find their way through this political situation that was changing quickly? A day after the coup, the new authorities repealed the law on the 2 languages of Ukraine. Before that, on the 20th of February 2014, nationalists of the Maidan set fire to a bus containing activists going from Odessa to Kiev to support the legitimate authorities. On the 25th of February, nationalists of the right sector promised to intercept any shows of separatism in the country, and to that end sent the so-called train of friendship with the slogan that Crimea would either be part of Ukraine or empty. And these are just a few episodes. The residents of Odessa, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov, and other cities began to think about how, in those conditions, they could ensure their own security, their self-identity, and their right to talk and be educated in their native language and to honor their own history. With an example of the Kiev Maidan before their eyes, activists in the eastern regions began to seize administrative buildings. However, if the Vice President of the USA, Joe Biden, came to President Yanukovych preying upon him to in no way use force against the civilian population, Mr. Turchinov, who came to power, immediately called upon those in the southeast to cease protest activities and threatening the use of military force. And this is despite the fact that, unlike on the Maidan, the protesters in the southeast were not, as in Kiev, using bulldozers, and the police were not having bricks thrown at them and Molotov cocktails. Nevertheless, on the 14th of April 2014, a decree was signed on the beginning of the so-called anti-terrorist operation. The usurpers of power in Kiev immediately wrote off their own population as terrorists. And now they're not even left. All we have is the Russian aggressor, Who of those here remembers that after what happened in the Odessa House of the Unions, where on the 2nd of May 2014, around 50 people were burnt alive by nationalists simply because they did not agree with the ideals of the new authorities in Kiev? This is a gross crime that has still not been investigated. On the same day, a storming of the city of Slavyansk began. Turchinov also said about this, "I will not rest until this city is wiped from the face of the earth." On the 14th and 15th of October 2014, in Kiev, Kharkov, Odessa and a number of other cities of Ukraine, there were torchlit processions of neo-Nazis with fascist symbols. At the protests, of course, there were also quotes from Hitler. Trying to find a political way out of the situation, parliamentarians of the southeast regions of Ukraine on the 22nd of February 2014 in Kharkov held a congress where the main appeal was for the preservation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine through federalization. However, after the events I mentioned, the population of the southeast of Ukraine it was evident to them that it would not be possible to find a peaceful agreement with Kiev, and that was what happened. Punitive voluntary brigades and regular forces were sent to punish the population, as well as nationalists and radicals, and a civil war began. Since the 12th of February 2015, there has been the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements in existence. This document is the basis for the settlement, and nobody disputes that. Just like nobody can dispute the fact that Russia is not mentioned at all in this document. Today, we have disseminated as a Security Council document materials that illustrate this and highlighting a violation of the Minsk package of measures by the Ukrainian authorities, and we're ready to share that with anybody who wishes to see it. Direct dialogue with their own population in the southeast is something that Kiev categorically refuses to do, replacing it with slogans about mythical Russian occupation. The Ukrainian authorities, supported by Washington, are shamelessly ignoring and sabotaging the implementation of the package of measures. The best illustration of this is the fact that on the 5th of February this year, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine declared the beginning of a criminal prosecution of one of the leaders of the Ukrainian opposition, Medvedchuk, who presented his candidacy for the 31st of March presidential elections. The reason for this prosecution was his appeal for the direct dialogue between Kiev and Donbass, which is written into the Minsk agreements, and to give the region special status within Ukraine. In other words, the implementation of the Minsk agreements now in Ukraine is equated to high treason and punished with criminal prosecution. I remind you that Medvedchuk is also an official representative of Kiev in the Minsk contact group. And this is what he recently said. I quote, "I'm confident that under this government, probably it won't be possible to change anything in the context of the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Any government that wins at the elections needs to tackle the main problem, establishing peace and putting an end to hostilities." End quote. President Poroshenko just said, as is typical to him, once again, turned the situation with a possible peacekeeping operation in Donbass on its head. He forgot to say that in the relevant draft Security Council resolution, this was introduced by Russia. However, it did not suit Ukraine and its Western sponsors because it is precisely in accordance with the Minsk agreements. Kiev's aim is the opposite one, to sabotage the Minsk process, which the Ukrainian president just said once again today and through gritted teeth. In respect of Donbass, and Crimea, incidentally, for several years there's been a full economic, transport and energy blockade in effect. In these conditions, the Russian Federation is unable to help the population of the southeast of Ukraine to survive. That is why we are sending regular humanitarian convoys there, and that is why we have introduced the ruble. Any other possibility to ensure normal life is not available to the people living in Donbass. On the 14th of November 2014, President Poroshenko said, and I quote, "There will be work and they won't have it. We will have pensions and they won't. We will have the support of the people and children and pensioners, and they won't. Our children will go to school and kindergartens, but there they will sit under rubble. And that is how we will win this war, ultimately." End quote. And I would like to ask those Europeans who are in the room here today who advance the values of diversity, do you think that this is normal to use military force and threaten military force against those with different political views and cultural customs? I hope that having refreshed your memories, you will ultimately realize and be dubious over the fact that Kiev is spreading information to introduce and mislead people. The price of this terrible mistake is human lives, and until the necessary treatment is given, until Kiev is stopped from being pushed into sabotage, there will be no settlement. To put it simply, the Kiev authorities need to begin to talk to their own people. At the end of November, President Poroshenko's rating was no more than 5%. However, thanks to a number of provocations, including in the Kerch Strait, the schism with the glaring interference of the state in the affairs of the church, and the boorish accusations against Russia, he's been able to raise that rating to 10%. Today, this General Assembly Hall has become nothing other than an election campaigning rostrum. Let's look to see what today's meeting will add or not to his approval rating. I'd like to recall as well that the Ukrainian authorities, not only in spite of their obligations under the OSCE, have cut off access of Russian observers to the presidential elections in Ukraine, they have also deprived 3.5 million Ukrainians living in Russia of the opportunity to vote, just like the almost 4 million residents of Donbass. Now, what do you think? Who would they vote for, or rather not vote for, these Ukrainian voters? Ukraine is a classical example of external interference and geopolitical engineering, a technique that the collective West has mastered and is now applying in Venezuela. And with Ukraine, it's doubly useful for them because the main target of this geopolitical chessboard is Russia. For us, the Ukrainian conflict is a pain. For the Western strategists, it's a joy because in your imagination, the worse it is for Russia, the better it is for you. Ukraine is sinking ever deeper into the mire of political chaos, corruption, and illegal lawfulness, aggressive nationalism. The unprecedented nature of the situation of discrimination of linguistic, educational, cultural rights, and the freedoms of the Russian language population is now unprecedented. The reigning legal nihilism in Ukraine and lawlessness is not receiving the necessary reaction from Western backers, which is only encouraging the ruling regime to new anti-democratic steps and to violate the norms of morals and civilized behavior. So that's the picture that we have, Mr. President. Thank you.
Doy las gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.